There's a question that nobody in the 1880s thought to ask. They were already asking the right ones. How much land? How many cattle? Where the nearest water was? They were smart, practical people making rational decisions under brutal conditions. And still, on the 12th of January, 1888, the temperature in parts of Dakota Territory dropped 18 degrees in 3 minutes. By nightfall, somewhere between 200 and 235 people were dead across Nebraska, Dakota, and Minnesota, most of them children who'd walked to school that morning in 50-degree weather and left their coats at home. So, here is the question nobody asked. What did the people who survived that kind of cold already know that the people who didn't survive had never learned? Something much quieter than dramatic survival stories. Something so practical it almost disappears, the specific, physical arrangement of materials between a sleeping body and the ground beneath it. Rufus Sage wrote about it in 1846. Osborne Russell wrote about it in the 1830s. George Ruxton wrote about it in 1848. Nobody read those books and thought, this is the part that matters. They copied the buffalo robe. They bought the blankets. They skipped the one thing that made all of it work. This is about that one thing. Osborne Russell spent 9 years trapping in the Rocky Mountains, from 1834 to 1843. He kept a journal. It survived, and in it, tucked between accounts of Blackfoot raids and elk kills and the geography of rivers nobody in the East had mapped yet, he described a night he considered comfortable, not extraordinary, just comfortable, by mountain standards. Here we had plenty of wood, water, meat, and dry grass to sleep on. And taking everything into consideration, we thought ourselves comfortably situated comfortably, I say, for mountaineers, not for those who never repose on anything but a bed of down. Dry grass to sleep on, not in, not under, on. That small word is where everything starts. Russell knew something that took us a remarkably long time to measure properly. He knew it the way you know things when the cost of not knowing is your life, not as a theory, not as advice you read somewhere, but as a settled, physical fact that had been worked out over decades of sleeping on actual ground in actual cold. He knew that the earth beneath him was not a neutral surface. It was a drain. The men who trapped beaver in the Rocky Mountains during the 1820s, 30s, and 40s operated in temperatures that regularly hit -30. They slept outdoors for months at a time. Their entire equipment was stripped to what a horse or mule could carry: 2 blankets, traps, a rifle, powder, lead, a kettle. Washington Irving recorded the standard outfit: 2 blankets, and everything else they understood about how to use them. And they did not die of cold in their sleep. That's the thing worth stopping on. The homesteaders who came after them, arriving on the Great Plains in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, brought more blankets, more quilts, more layers piled on top, and they still woke up cold, still froze their feet on dirt floors, still drank from cups they held with stiff hands over fires they fed through the night. Laura Ingalls Wilder described it directly waking to find ice on the quilt where rain had leaked through the shanty roof, pulling heated flat irons into the bed because there was no other way to get warm. The trappers had more cold and fewer blankets. The homesteaders had more blankets and more cold. Something is wrong with the usual explanation. Here is what we've been told about how insulation works, and here is where that explanation goes wrong. We know insulation traps air. We know still air is a poor conductor of heat. It doesn't move heat the way solid materials do. We know that a thick quilt or a wool blanket creates a pocket of warmed air between itself and the body, and that pocket stays warm because the quilt slows heat loss through it. All of that is true. What that explanation leaves out is direction. Your body loses heat in every direction simultaneously, up through the blankets, sideways into the air, and down straight down into whatever surface you're lying on. The blanket explanation only addresses one direction. It treats all 3 heat loss pathways as roughly equivalent, and they are not remotely equivalent. Dry soil conducts heat at roughly 0.36 watts per meter Kelvin. Moist soil conducts at about 0.84. Frozen ground, the ground beneath a Nebraska homestead in January, conducts at approximately 2 watts per meter Kelvin. Still air conducts at 0.025 watts per meter Kelvin. Work through the ratios. Moist soil pulls heat roughly 33 times faster than still air. Frozen ground pulls heat roughly 80 times faster. The surface above you, the cold air you're breathing, is the weak pathway. The surface below you is where your body's warmth goes first, fastest, and without stopping. The ground is not passive. It is an active drain with effectively infinite thermal mass. You cannot warm it, you cannot fill it. It will take your body heat for as many hours as you give it access, and it will not change temperature noticeably in return. That is what you are lying on when you sleep on a sod house floor, or a rough plank, or a thin, compressed mattress over bare earth. Now think about what happens to insulation under body weight. A thick quilt placed on top of you maintains its loft. The fibers stay separated. The air stays trapped. The quilt does what it's supposed to do. A thick quilt placed beneath you takes your full body weight, 70 or 140 or 160 pounds, pressing down into it and compresses to nearly nothing. The fibers flatten. The air escapes. What was 4 inches of meaningful insulation becomes a 1/4 inch of fabric with almost no thermal resistance left in it. This is the single fact that changes everything. The person who gets this right does not pile more blankets on top. The person who gets this right builds something thick and springy and compression resistant between their body and the ground before anything else gets laid down. The insulation above you can be thin and it will still work. The insulation below you must be thick enough to hold its structure under your weight, and if it flattens, nothing you put on top will save you. The trappers knew this. They got it from people who had known it for centuries. You're standing inside a crow lodge in the winter of 1835. The lodge is made from 15 or 20 buffalo hides sewn together, stretched over a cone of poles 30 feet high. It isn't warm the way a house is warm. It's warm the way a thing designed specifically for the cold is warm, which is a different thing entirely. George Catlin visited 50 tribes between 1830 and 1836, and wrote about the crow lodges in particular. Their skins were dressed, he noted, almost white as linen, which meant they were permeable to light, but sealed against wind. The construction was not decorative. Every dimension was functional. The floor inside is covered first with grass, prairie grass, cut and laid in a layer 6 to 12 inches deep, the blades cross-hatched so the mass doesn't collapse easily under weight. Then, over the grass, rawhide scraped buffalo skin that hasn't been tanned fully soft, still stiff enough to act as a moisture barrier, keeping the ground's dampness from wicking up through the grass. Then, laid over that, the sleeping robe. The sleeping robe is a full winter-killed buffalo hide, brain-tanned until soft enough to fold, with the fur left on. The fur of a winter bison is not like the fur of a summer bison. By January, it has grown to 2 or 3 inches of dense, crimped underfur, each fiber hollow for additional insulation, with longer guard hairs over it. The whole robe weighs close to 20 pounds. One side goes on the ground, fur up. The sleeper goes on that. A second robe or blanket comes over the top, fur down. The National Park Service documented exactly this arrangement at Bent's old fort. Women dressed the sleeping robes until they were as soft as possible. The effort was deliberate. A stiff robe doesn't drape. A stiff robe doesn't conform to the body. The women who made these robes understood what the robe had to do, and they made it capable of doing it. And beneath all of it, 6 inches of dry grass that does not compress to nothing under body weight. Because grass, unlike woven fabric, has structural memory. The blades push back. The air stays in. The drain is blocked. Rufus Sage described the standard field arrangement in 1846. A single buffalo robe folded double, with the fold acting as ground insulation and the open half coming up over the body, plus an additional blanket on top. Warren Angus Ferris, trapping from 1830 to 1835, described camp floors covered in reeds before the robes went down. George Frederick Ruxton watched a trapper select a sleeping spot and immediately begin engineering it. Choose the high ground to avoid drainage, cut channels around the perimeter so meltwater ran away from the body, bring a flat stone for a pillow, lay the robe over prepared ground. That's not lying down, That's building a sleeping system. The homesteaders who came after these men looked at the buffalo robe and copied it as an object, a warm covering, like a very heavy blanket. They brought the robe, but not the understanding of what the robe was part of. And by the 1880s, even the robes were gone. By 1880, the bison population had collapsed below 400,000 animals across the entire Great Plains. By the late 1880s, only a few hundred remained. The great robe trade that had supplied trappers and native peoples and eventually Eastern merchants for 60 years was over. The homesteaders arriving in Nebraska and Dakota Territory in the 1870s and 1880s could not buy a buffalo robe at any reasonable price. Charles Augustus Murray had recorded robe prices at $3.50 at Missouri River agencies in the 1830s, $6.50 to $10 retail in eastern cities, acquirable then for someone who needed one. By the time families were filing on quarter sections under the Homestead Act of 1862, the market for robes had already started contracting. By the worst winters of the 1880s, robes were artifacts. What homesteaders slept under was quilts. What homesteaders slept on was whatever they could afford, and what they could afford was almost always inadequate. The 1,897 Sears catalog listed corn husk mattresses at $2 to $3. Straw ticks canvas bags stuffed with straw were the cheaper option still, and the more common one on the soddy frontier. One former homesteader recalled them precisely. Each day to make up the bed, you had to reach your hand into the tick and fluff up the contents so that straw did not settle in one place. A freshly stuffed straw tick might be 4 inches deep, which would give a meaningful, though not excellent, layer of insulation. 2 weeks of sleeping on it, and it had compressed to roughly 2 inches, then 1. The insulating value dropped proportionally. There was no grass layer below the tick. There was no rawhide moisture barrier. There was the tick, and below it a plank floor or packed dirt. The plank floor, if the family had one, gave approximately R1. 4 per inch of softwood, meaning a 1-inch plank, gave R1, 4 total. Frozen ground gave effectively nothing. A modern sleeping pad rated for winter camping starts at R4 and goes to R7 or higher. The average homestead sleeping surface was operating at R1 to R2 inches, the best cases, and R0 inches many. Isabel Fodge Cornish recorded what happened in a sod schoolhouse in Nebraska in the winter of 1884. The floor was of dirt, and during the cold winter of 1884, the teacher's feet were frosted. Later, a quantity of straw was put on the floor, which made it warmer. Someone put straw on the floor, and it got warmer. The person who did that was solving the right problem. They almost certainly did not know it. The most detailed account of what proper ground insulation actually felt like comes from Warren Angus Ferris, who traded in the knowledge of the men around him for 5 years and wrote about it plainly in 1836. Sleep more refreshing and dreams more sweet were never vouchsafed to me than those which waited upon my grassy couch beneath the sky canopy of night. He was describing sleeping outside. He was describing sleeping on the ground, in the Rocky Mountains, in a manner that produced sleep more refreshing than anything he'd known before. This is not hyperbole from a man trying to romanticize hardship. Ferris was a practical observer who documented elevation readings, river gradients, and beaver populations. When he says the sleep was better, he means the sleep was better. The ground preparation worked well enough that exhausted men genuinely rested rather than shivering through until morning. John Ball, traveling with the Wyeth Party in 1832, described his own outdoor sleeping arrangement. I spread the robe on the ground, wrapped the blanket about my feet and the cloak around me, throwing the cape loosely over my head to break off the moonshine, and a saddle for my pillow. Read that sequence. Robe on the ground first. Everything else secondary. The robe wasn't the covering, the robe was the foundation. Lewis Garrard, in 1850, documented the mountaineer custom of sleeping in pairs, selecting partners before dismounting, before tending horses, before making camp. The warmth of a second body matters, but the sequence was fixed. First the ground arrangement, then everything else. The mountain man who skipped the ground layer in favor of extra coverings was making the same error the homesteaders would make 30 years later with their quilts and corn husk mattresses. Here is the way the analogy works, and here is where it breaks down. Think of insulation as a valve, a one-way heat gate. Insulation placed above you does something useful. It slows the heat. Your body radiates upward, trapping it in the small space between skin and fabric. That space gets warm, and warm air is a poor conductor, so a cycle of warming becomes self-sustaining. Your own heat maintains itself. Insulation placed below you is supposed to do the same thing in the opposite direction. But the valve below you has an adversary. The valve above you doesn't. Your own weight. Every pound you press into the mattress compresses the insulation, squeezes out the trapped air, collapses the structure that makes the thermal resistance work. The insulation above stays open. The insulation below gets crushed. The gate on the bottom stays open whether you want it to or not, unless you use materials thick enough and stiff enough that your weight can't close it. Dry prairie grass, reeds, pine boughs. These work not just because they trap air, but because they push back. They have enough structural resilience to maintain an air layer under a sleeping adult. A cotton quilt has none of that resistance. A thin straw tick has almost none after the first few nights. The Crow understood this. The Shoshone understood this. The Mandan built it into their earth lodges, sleeping platforms of woven willows raised off the ground, with winter-killed buffalo hides laid over the lattice. Prince Maximilian of Wide, visiting the Mandan villages in 1833 and 1834 with the artist Karl Bodmer, described the sleeping areas in detail. The beds were raised, the hides were heavy, and the people sleeping in them were warm when temperatures outside fell past any measurement he'd been trained to record. George Catlin made the same observation independently. Inside those lodges, at temperatures Europeans found lethal, the inhabitants were comfortable. The mountain men learned from those same people not from books, but from proximity, and often from marriage. Washington Irving recorded in 1837 a Nez Perce woman's description of her domestic role, which included pitching the lodge, preparing the sleeping area, and managing everything in the camp that kept people from dying at night. The knowledge traveled through that daily work, not through formal instruction. A trapper who married into a Nez Perce or Crow community didn't get handed a manual. He watched his wife prepare the sleeping area, and after a winter he understood why it worked, and after 5 winters he did it automatically. The homesteaders had no such proximity. They arrived already knowing how to sleep, which meant they arrived already knowing wrong. Now here is the third element, the one that doesn't fit anywhere in the story until it does. An Ohio farmer named James Hahn arrived in Colorado Territory in 1859, pulled toward the gold fields, and spent several months in a succession of camps before concluding the mines weren't for him. He left journals. They're not famous. He recorded something that seemed incidental, sharing a camp with a former trapper who showed him how to lay a bed. Hahn found it unnecessary. He had a wool blanket. The trapper cut grass from the creek bank, 6-8 inches of it, laid over the campsite, then his robe over that. Then he invited Hahn to try it. Hahn wrote, "I confess I had not slept with such ease since leaving Ohio, and could not account for why a pile of grass should make the difference my companion assured me it did. He couldn't account for it. He felt the effect but lacked the physics to explain it. And when he returned to farming in Ohio, he took back the wool blanket and left the grass knowledge on the trail." That's a very small story. It matters because it happened thousands of times. The knowledge was available. It was demonstrated directly. It was felt. And it didn't transfer, because the people receiving it had no conceptual framework for ground heat loss, and the people transmitting it had no language for physics. They just knew the grass worked. The knowing lived in their hands and their backs, not in sentences. In the 1840s and 1850s, when the fur trade was winding down and former trappers were filtering back into settlements, they brought exactly this kind of knowledge. Kit Carson settled in Taos. Joe Meek went to Oregon and became a sheriff. Thomas Fitzpatrick became an Indian agent. None of them wrote instruction manuals about sleeping on the ground, because to them, the ground preparation was so obvious it didn't need writing. like breathing, like not standing in a river during a flood. The obvious things are exactly what never gets explained. The 12th of January, 1888. The morning starts at 50 degrees Fahrenheit across Nebraska and Dakota Territory. Children walk to school without coats. It's practically warm. By early afternoon, a cold front moving at 45 miles per hour hits the temperature from behind. In Moorhead, Minnesota, the thermometer reaches minus 47 degrees Fahrenheit. In parts of Dakota, 18 degrees drop in 3 minutes when the front arrives. Those children were now outside. Lois Royce was a teacher in Plainview, Nebraska. Her schoolhouse ran out of fuel by 3 in the afternoon. Her boarding house was 82 yards away, less than the length of a football field. She told her 3 students, 2 9-year-old boys and a 6-year-old girl, to stay inside while she went for help. She walked out the door into the whiteout. She couldn't find the boarding house. She couldn't find anything. She wandered for hours. By the time she was found, both her feet were frozen solid. She lost them both. Her 3 students, left in the schoolhouse that she intended to rescue them from, froze to death before morning. Etta Shattuck, 19 years old, found a haystack. She crawled in. She was there for 78 hours before anyone found her. She survived the storm. She died weeks later from the amputation surgery. That is the insulation principle in its most desperate form. Etta Shattuck did not know the physics. She didn't know about R values, or thermal conductivity, or the difference between compression-resistant insulation and compression-vulnerable insulation. She found a haystack and got inside it because it was the only available warmth, and it worked well enough to keep her alive for 78 hours in a storm that killed 235 people. Hay. Prairie grass. The same material Osborne Russell described sleeping on 50 years earlier, 2,000 miles west. The same material the Crow laid 6 inches deep on their lodge floors before the robes went down. The same material the Homesteaders did not put under their beds in the sod houses and planked houses and poorly insulated frame structures that were going up across the plains in the 1870s and 1880s. David Laskin, who wrote extensively about the children's blizzard, noted that for years afterward, at any gathering of any size in Nebraska or Dakota, you would see people walking on wooden legs, or holding fingerless hands behind their backs, or hiding missing ears under hats. This was not an unusually bad winter. The hard winter of 1880 to 1881 had been worse in duration, 6 months of blizzards from October through April. Temperatures so sustained that the Chicago and Northwestern Railway was buried under 20-foot drifts and could not run for months. DeSmet, Dakota Territory, where the Ingalls family lived, was cut off from supply trains all winter. Laura described the family's survival: twisting hay into fuel, grinding wheat in a coffee mill because the mill couldn't reach town, heating flatirons on the stove and bringing them into the bed, heating flat irons and bringing them into the bed, because the bed itself, without any preparation of the ground beneath it, couldn't hold warmth through the night. And 3 years before the children's blizzard, the Great Die-Up of 1886 to 1887 had killed 60 to 90% of cattle across the northern plains. Temperatures hit minus 46 degrees Fahrenheit in Montana. Theodore Roosevelt, who owned 2 ranches near Medora, Dakota Territory, wrote to Henry Cabot Lodge that the losses were crippling. He found cattle frozen, standing on their feet, and lost nearly half his net worth in a single winter. The cattle froze because the same principle that threatens sleeping humans also threatens standing animals. The ground pulls heat from any warm body resting or standing against it. The animals had no shelter that blocked conductive heat loss. And most of the ranchers themselves were sleeping on mattresses that compressed to near nothing by midnight. Here is what the research actually shows. A Princeton University Wilderness Medicine Guide used today in outdoor survival training specifies a minimum of 4 inches of insulation beneath a patient, particularly between the patient and the ground, before any other treatment for cold. 4 inches minimum. That number comes from exactly the physics Russell and Ferris and the Crow were solving empirically. You need enough material below the body to maintain a meaningful air gap under sleeping weight. A 2025 study published in PubMed Central on conductive heat loss in simulated outdoor conditions measured the heat flux from the front of the body and the heat flux from the body's contact surface. In extreme cold with compressed insulation below the sleeper, the rate of heat movement through the contact surface was 25% faster than through the front of the body exposed to air. Modern sleeping pad standards define an R-value baseline of 5.38 for cold weather use. Industry testing shows that using a pad rated below R1.3 drops a sleeping bag's effective temperature rating by 10 degrees Fahrenheit, not because the bag changes, but because the bag's bottom layer is compressed by body weight and ceases to function. The bag above you works, the bag below you doesn't. Only what's beneath you, if it has the resistance to hold its structure, saves you. A 1-inch softwood plank the floor of a better-built homestead cabin provides R1.4. Compressed corn husk after 2 weeks of sleeping, approximately R1. Packed dirt, effectively R0. Frozen ground conducts heat away from you rather than simply failing to stop it. 4 inches of dry prairie grass gives R5 to R8. 6 inches of pine boughs gives R5 to R8. A buffalo robe folded double reaches R4 to R6, even under moderate compression, because the coarse winter fur has enough structural resilience to maintain air pockets under weight. The trapper's complete system grass layer, rawhide barrier, folded robe was hitting R12 to R18 beneath the sleeper. The Homesteaders system compressed straw tick on a plank was hitting R1 to R2. The blankets piled on top weren't the problem. The floor was always the problem. There's something about this that deserves sitting with for a moment. We tend to think about survival knowledge as the dramatic kind: how to start a fire without matches, how to navigate without a compass, how to find water in a desert. But the knowledge that kept trappers alive through 9 Rocky Mountain winters wasn't dramatic. It was habitual. Russell didn't write about ground preparation the way someone writes about a daring river crossing. He mentioned it in passing, between noting how much meat was available and how the grass in the valley looked. It was too ordinary to emphasize. Joe Meek, who trapped in the Rockies through the 1830s, spent one catastrophic night in the winter of 1829 without his robe lost from his party, no gear, wandering tied to his mule, because he knew he'd freeze if he stopped moving. He survived, but that night was exceptional. What kept him alive through hundreds of ordinary nights was the habitual preparation he performed without thinking: the ground layer, the folded robe, the sleeping partner beside him, the location chosen for drainage and shelter. None of that was dramatic. All of it was necessary. The homesteaders weren't careless. They were carrying a different set of habits, built for a different environment. Eastern sleeping rope beds, then frame beds, then mattresses, always elevated off the floor, always in enclosed rooms, always in structures that moderated temperature before it reached the sleeper, didn't require ground insulation because the ground was never a factor. The bed kept you off the floor. The room kept the air from dropping to zero. The problem of ground heat loss simply didn't exist in the places these settlers came from. They arrived on the plains, where the floors were dirt and the walls were sod, and the winter temperatures were a different category of cold than anything Ohio or Pennsylvania had prepared them for. And they brought their eastern habits with them intact. They piled more quilts on top. They heated flatirons. They did what their mothers had done and their grandmothers had done, and it was not enough. Maddie Oblinger, writing from Fillmore County, Nebraska, in the 1870s, her 318 letters are preserved at the Nebraska State Historical Society, described the cold in her frame house clearly. A temporary frame house here is a poor thing. The wind and dust goes right through, and they are very cold. She knew it was inadequate. She observed that a properly built sod house with interior plaster was better. She understood the problem in the structural terms available to her. She didn't have the vocabulary of thermal conductivity, but she knew the floor was wrong, and she said so. And then she died in February 1880 at 34 years old, and the specific knowledge of what would have helped her was sitting in Warren Angus Ferris's journal in a library no one was pointing her toward. The knowledge existed. The problem is, That survival knowledge rarely travels across context. The trapper's sleeping system was not a single invention. It was the result of contact with people who had already solved the problem and the willingness to copy the solution without requiring an explanation first. Washington Irving wrote in 1837 about the domestic knowledge native women managed in camp. When we halted in the evening, and he sat with the other braves and smoked, it was I that pitched his lodge. And when he came to eat and sleep, his supper and his bed were ready. The speaker was a Nez Perce woman describing her role. The knowledge embedded in that work which grass was appropriate, how deep to lay it, how to position the moisture barrier, how to dress a sleeping robe to the right stiffness lived in that work, not in any written record. Rudolf Friedrich Kurtz, documenting life in the fur trade in the 1840s, recorded the use of the apiskimos, the rawhide ground sheet, that served as a moisture barrier between the insulating layer and the sleeping robe. The word itself is a Blackfoot word. The technology moved from the Blackfoot to the trappers who worked in Blackfoot territory, and it moved through the women who prepared the camps, not through the men who wrote the memoirs. Lewis and Clark understood this imperfectly. On a buffalo robe, Lewis wrote simply, "We slept very well." Without adequate bedding on the Pacific coast when their robes were soaked and rotting from weeks of rain, the quality of sleep collapsed. The robe wasn't magic. The robe worked when the system around it worked. When the system failed, so did the robe. A 13-year-old boy in Lewis and Clark's party survived an unplanned night outdoors in a Rocky Mountain January. Temperatures passed 40 degrees below zero. With only a buffalo robe, he lost some toes to frostbite, nothing more. The robe was heavy enough and the fur dense enough that even without ground preparation, even in extremity, the compression resistance of 2 or 3 inches of winter bison fur maintained enough of an air layer to keep him alive. That's why the robe mattered, and why losing access to it mattered, and why the homesteaders who arrived after the bison were gone were operating without the one material that could have compensated for inadequate ground preparation. The thing that stayed with me, reading through all of this, is how many times the solution appeared and failed to transfer. James Hahn, sleeping on that grass bed in 1859, felt the difference and went home to Ohio having learned nothing he could name. The Nebraska schoolteacher with frosted feet got straw put on the floor and instantly felt better. Felt the solution working, but no one recorded who made the connection or whether that person understood why it worked. Etta Shattuck survived 78 hours in a haystack and became a story about endurance, not a story about insulation physics. The story that could have saved lives, the story about what was under the hay and why it worked, never got told as a lesson, only as a tragedy. We are not so different. We have central heating now. We have foam sleeping pads rated to specific R values, and sleeping bags tested to certified temperature ratings, and wilderness medicine guides that specify the minimum insulation beneath a patient down to the inch. We have all the information. We don't have the habit. Every few years, someone dies of hypothermia in a situation where they had the right sleeping bag but forgot the pad, or used a cheap foam mat that compressed to nothing by midnight and let the ground win. The physics hasn't changed. The ground is still pulling heat at 80 times the rate of still air. The sleeping bag on top still works. The thing below still matters more. The trappers would not have understood the numbers. They would have recognized the error immediately. What Osborne Russell called being comfortably situated was not a low standard. It was a high one, arrived at through the accumulated knowledge of people who had lived on the ground through the coldest winters in North America and learned, one cold night at a time, what the ground was doing and how to stop it. That knowledge was precise. It was physically correct. It was available to anyone who asked. The homesteaders didn't ask because they didn't know there was a question. The question was already there, under the mattress, waiting in the ground. Compartir conteúdo do projeto man montagne criado, por você how mountain men. Avoid these styles. These styles were used. TXT 317 Linhast XT.